October 8th, 1943. 25,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. The pencil barely moved across the combat report form as Oberstleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, processed what he had just witnessed through his canopy. He had flown over 500 combat missions, earned every decoration the Luftwaffe could bestow, and destroyed 206 enemy aircraft. But the sound he had heard moments before, growing from a distant rumble to a thunderous roar, carried a message that contradicted everything his experience told him about air warfare. The Americans' new fighters should not dominate at this altitude. No radial engine aircraft had ever controlled the skies above 30,000 feet. Yet here, approaching through the thin air with a distinctive, deep-throated howl that set his instruments vibrating, came formations of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, their Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp engines producing 2,000 horsepower and creating a sound that German pilots were learning meant death from above. Through his headset, Philipp heard his wingman, Feldwebel Hans Günther Reinhardt, transmit with barely concealed anxiety. "Commodore, they are diving again." Same tactic as last week. The last transmission from the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter commander to reach his base would be 2 words transmitted at 15:45 hours. Reinhardt, attack. Minutes later, Philipp's Focke-Wulf 190A6 disappeared into clouds at 15,000 feet, its engine damaged by 850 caliber machine guns that had fired from a Thunderbolt diving at over 500 miles per hour. The veteran ace managed to bail out at less than 50 meters altitude. His parachute failed to open. The pilot who may have delivered the fatal burst, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group's 61st Fighter Squadron, would write in his after-action report a phrase that captured the growing realization spreading through the Wehrmacht. Aircraft exploded. No parachute. If Philipp cannot survive against the Jug, no one can. What German commanders across Europe were discovering in the autumn of 1943 was that the distinctive sound of approaching Thunderbolts signaled something far more dangerous than just another enemy. Fighter. It announced the arrival of an industrial and technological superiority so overwhelming that experienced Luftwaffe aces with hundreds of victories were being systematically destroyed by American pilots flying aircraft that embodied a completely different philosophy of air combat. The sound of those 18-cylinder radial engines, amplified by General Electric turbo superchargers that allowed full power at altitudes where German fighters struggled to breathe, became the acoustic signature of Germany's coming defeat. For commanders who understood the mathematics of attrition, that sound meant the war was already over. They just did not know it yet. The story of how German military leadership came to fear the sound of P-47 Thunderbolts begins not with combat, but with catastrophic failure in North Africa. On May 13, 1943, General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered the remnants of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia. Approximately 275,000 German and Italian soldiers entered Allied captivity. Among the surrendered equipment lay hundreds of destroyed Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, their wreckage testament to American air superiority achieved through both numbers and quality. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most analytical commanders, spent his final days in North Africa documenting in his personal journal what Allied fighter tactics revealed about industrial capacity. His observations, discovered decades later in German military archives, provided historians with extraordinary insight into how professional Wehrmacht officers were beginning to understand the strategic situation. The Americans, Steinhoff wrote on May 8, 1943, do not fight as we do. They do not seek individual glory or dogfights between aces. Instead, they fly formations of such size that our veterans cannot maneuver against them. Today I counted 48 enemy fighters escorting 12 bombers, 48 escorts for 12 aircraft. This ratio is madness unless one possesses unlimited production, which, I now realize, they do. Steinhoff's entry for May 10th was more ominous. Radio intercepts suggest the Americans are deploying a new fighter to England, designation P-47. Details are scarce, but intelligence reports claim it weighs as much as our Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine destroyer, yet operates as a single-engine fighter. Reichsmarschall Göring dismisses these reports as Allied propaganda. I pray he is correct, but I fear he is not. If the Americans can build fighters of such size and power in quantity, while we struggle to replace aircraft lost in Russia, mathematics will decide this war regardless of pilot courage. The journey of German understanding about the Thunderbolt, from skepticism to terror, would parallel the aircraft's deployment to England beginning in November 1942. The initial response from Luftwaffe intelligence was dismissive, bordering on mockery. When reconnaissance photographs first captured P-47s at English airfields in late 1942, Luftwaffe evaluation teams could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The aircraft appeared grotesquely oversized. Its massive Pratt and Whitney radial engine, housed in a cowling nearly 5 feet in diameter, gave the Thunderbolt a frontal area more than twice that of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. The fuselage appeared bloated, bulging around the turbo supercharger installation that occupied nearly half the length of prosthetes, the aircraft. Early estimates calculated the P-47's empty weight at approximately 10,000 pounds, making it heavier than many light bombers. Major Josef Priller, commanding officer of Jägerschwader 26, recalled in a 1952 interview conducted by American military historians his first reaction to intelligence briefings about the Thunderbolt in February 1943. We were shown photographs and specifications captured from a downed bomber crew's briefing materials. When I saw the weight figures, I assumed there had been a translation error. When assured the numbers were correct, our entire operations room burst into laughter. An 8-ton fighter. It was absurd. Some of my pilots began calling them Jabos before birth, meaning they were so heavy they were born as fighter bombers, not real fighters. We assumed they would be easy victories, fat and slow. Priller's laughter would not last past spring. What German intelligence failed to grasp, and what Luftwaffe pilots would discover at horrific cost, was that the Thunderbolt's enormous size was not a design flaw, but a deliberate engineering choice. The massive fuselage housed not just a turbo supercharger, but a sophisticated intercooler system, ammunition for 8 50-caliber machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks with 305 gallons capacity, armor plating, protecting pilot and critical systems, and structural reinforcement that made the aircraft nearly indestructible. The R-2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower at military power and up to 2,300 horsepower with water methanol injection, gave the Thunderbolt performance that contradicted every assumption German pilots had made based on its appearance. The Thunderbolt's combat debut over Europe in April 1943 initially seemed to confirm German expectations. The 56th Fighter Group, first American unit equipped with P-47s, flew its first escort missions with mixed results. The aircraft's early combat record showed promise but also revealed limitations. Its initial range, approximately 450 miles without external tanks, meant escorts could barely reach the German border before turning back. The Thunderbolt climbed slowly compared to German fighters, taking nearly 13 minutes to reach 30,000 feet. Its turn radius was wider than the nimble Messerschmitt 109 or Focke-Wulf 190. These characteristics led some Luftwaffe pilots to maintain their initial assessment. The fat American fighter was vulnerable if engaged correctly. But what happened next transformed German perception completely. Throughout May and June 1943, Thunderbolt pilots developed tactics that exploited their aircraft's genuine strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. They discovered that while the P-47 could not turn with German fighters, it could dive faster than any aircraft in existence. When bounced by Luftwaffe interceptors, Thunderbolt pilots would roll inverted and dive, accelerating to speeds that made pursuit impossible. The Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine, fed by its turbocharger, maintained full power through these vertical descents, pulling the Thunderbolt through dives that would tear the wings off German fighters. Then, energy preserved, the American pilots would zoom back to altitude, turn the tables, and attack from above. German pilots found themselves facing an opponent that defied every rule of aerial combat they had learned. The Thunderbolt was supposed to be slow, yet it dived at over 500 miles per hour and maintained over 400 miles per hour in level flight at altitude. It was supposed to be fragile, yet it absorbed 20mm cannon hits that would obliterate a Messerschmitt and kept flying. It was supposed to lack firepower, yet its .850 caliber machine guns delivered a weight of fire that could saw a fighter in half. Most frustratingly, the Thunderbolt was supposed to be rare, limited by the complexity and cost of building such massive fighters. Instead, they appeared in ever-increasing numbers. By summer 1943, German interceptor pilots faced not dozens but hundreds of Thunderbolts on every mission. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Luftwaffe pilots had entered the war confident in their equipment and training. They flew aircraft designed by the world's leading aeronautical engineers, powered by engines from companies that pioneered high-performance aviation. They had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Yet here was an American fighter, designed by immigrants, powered by an engine that looked primitive compared to German inline designs, that was systematically destroying Germany's air defense. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became associated not with an engineering curiosity but with an existential threat. The transformation of the Thunderbolt from curiosity to terror weapon accelerated during Big Week in February 1944, when Allied air forces launched maximum effort missions against German aircraft production facilities. During 6 days of intensive operations, over 3,000 American heavy bombers struck targets deep in Germany, escorted by nearly 1,000 fighters, including substantial numbers of Thunderbolts. Luftwaffe defenders rose to meet the threat, launching hundreds of interceptors. The resulting air battles produced losses on both sides, but the mathematics were catastrophic for Germany. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 500 fighters and 300 irreplaceable pilots. American losses, while significant, were replaced within weeks. The P-47 had proven itself not just tactically effective but strategically decisive. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots with indeed over 200 victories, encountered Thunderbolts repeatedly during this period. His assessment, recorded in debriefing reports that survived the war, provided insight into how even elite Luftwaffe pilots viewed the American fighter. The P-47 is the most formidable opponent we face. It combines altitude performance superior to our fighters, speed we cannot match above 25,000 feet, firepower that destroys with minimal hits, and structural strength that makes it nearly impossible to shoot down. More critically, Americans fly it in formations so large that individual skill becomes irrelevant. When 12 Thunderbolts attack a single German fighter, no amount of tactical genius will save that pilot. This is not how air combat should be fought, but it is devastatingly effective. The technical sophistication of the Thunderbolt became apparent to German engineers who examined crashed examples and analyzed combat reports. The turbocharger system, in particular, represented a level of engineering integration that German industry struggled to match. The system used exhaust gases from the R-2800 engine to drive a turbine that compressed incoming air, maintaining sea-level pressure at high altitude. This allowed the engine to produce its full 2,000 horsepower at 30,000 feet, where German fighters experienced significant power loss. The intercooler then reduced the temperature of compressed air before it entered the engine, further improving performance. This entire system operated automatically, allowing pilots to focus on combat rather than engine management. German attempts to develop equivalent systems encountered repeated failures. The turbocharger technology required metallurgy capable of withstanding extreme temperatures, precision manufacturing that could produce components to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and complex control systems that could maintain optimal performance across varying conditions. Germany possessed the theoretical knowledge but lacked the industrial capacity to produce reliable turbochargers in quantity. Several German fighters incorporated turbocharger systems experimentally, but none achieved operational status before war's end. The Thunderbolt's turbocharger, manufactured by General Electric in facilities that produced hundreds of units monthly, represented not just an engineering achievement, but an industrial one that Germany could not replicate. The structural strength of the Thunderbolt became legendary among both American and German pilots. On June 26, 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson experienced what would become one of the most famous incidents illustrating the aircraft's durability. Returning from escort duties over France, Johnson's Thunderbolt was attacked by multiple Focke-Wulf 190s. In the resulting engagement, his aircraft sustained damage from hundreds of machine gun rounds and at least one 20mm cannon shell. The canopy shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed throughout the cockpit, one wing lost substantial fabric covering, and the tail surfaces were riddled with holes. Johnson's face was burned by hydraulic fluid, his vision impaired by swelling around his eyes. Yet the Thunderbolt continued to fly. Johnson nursed the damaged aircraft across the English Channel and landed safely at his base. Post-flight inspection revealed that the P-47 had been hit by over 200 rounds. Any other fighter would have disintegrated. The Thunderbolt brought its pilot home. This incident, far from unique, became emblematic of the Thunderbolt's reputation for survivability. Luftwaffe pilots reported instances where they had achieved what should have been killing hits on Thunderbolts, only to watch the American fighters continue flying. The massive radial engine could lose multiple cylinders and continue producing power. The robust airframe could absorb structural damage that would cripple other aircraft. The redundant control systems meant battle damage rarely resulted in complete loss of control. German fighter pilots, trained to deliver precise burst aimed at vulnerable points, found their marksmanship negated by an aircraft designed to absorb punishment. The psychological effect was devastating. Pilots who had achieved dozens of victories against Soviet and British fighters found themselves unable to destroy Thunderbolts despite achieving textbook attacks. The firepower advantage the Thunderbolt possessed further demoralized German defenders. 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, gave the P-47 a rate of fire exceeding 100 rounds per second. Each gun carried between 267 and 425 rounds, providing roughly 20 seconds of continuous fire. The 50 caliber projectile, while smaller than the 20mm cannon shells used by German fighters, proved devastatingly effective. The high rate of fire created a dense stream of projectiles that increased hit probability. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate armor plate, ignite fuel tanks, and destroy engine blocks. Luftwaffe pilots learned that even brief exposure to Thunderbolt fire often proved fatal. Comparisons between the Thunderbolt's 8 machine guns and the typical armament of German fighters revealed the American advantage. A Messerschmitt Bf 109G carried one 30mm cannon and two 13mm machine guns. A Focke-Wulf 190A8 carried two 13mm machine guns and four 20mm cannons. While German weapons delivered more destructive force per hit, their slower rate of fire and limited ammunition capacity meant German pilots had perhaps 5 seconds of firing time before exhausting their ammunition. Thunderbolt pilots could maintain fire 3 to 4 times longer. In the fluid environment of air combat, where firing opportunities lasted fractions of a second, the sustained fire capability of the P-47 proved decisive. The range extension of the Thunderbolt through external fuel tanks represented another technological achievement that German industry struggled to match. Early P-47s carried 305 gallons of internal fuel, providing approximately 450 miles of combat radius. By mid-1943, Republic Aviation and USAAF maintenance personnel had developed techniques for mounting external drop tanks under the Thunderbolt's wings and fuselage. These tanks, initially containing 75 gallons and later expanded to 150 gallons, nearly doubled the aircraft's range. By early 1944, Thunderbolts routinely escorted bombers to targets 500 miles inside Germany and returned safely to England. This range extension had profound strategic implications. German fighter defences had been organised on the assumption that Allied escorts would turn back before reaching critical targets. Interceptor units stationed in the Reich interior could engage bombers without facing fighter opposition. The arrival of long-range Thunderbolts destroyed this assumption. Luftwaffe units now faced American fighters over their own airfields, over their training areas, over their factories. The psychological impact extended beyond tactical considerations. German pilots launching from bases that were supposed to be sanctuary found themselves fighting for survival in their own landing patterns. The distinctive sound of Thunderbolt engines became audible over German cities, destroying any remaining illusion that the homeland was safe from Allied air power. The training pipeline for Thunderbolt pilots represented yet another dimension of American advantage. German fighter pilots, by late 1943, received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages and the need to replace combat losses quickly. Many Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with less than 100 hours of flight time and minimal gunnery practice. American fighter pilots, by contrast, typically completed over 200 hours of training before deploying to combat theaters. They practiced formation flying until it became instinctive, fired thousands of rounds at aerial targets to develop marksmanship, and studied combat tactics in classrooms and simulators. This training differential compounded in combat. German pilots with minimal experience faced American pilots who had been carefully prepared for the challenges they would encounter. The development of Thunderbolt tactics by American fighter groups demonstrated how institutional learning transformed raw capability into combat effectiveness. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, pioneered many techniques that other units would adopt. Zemke, a pragmatic commander who valued results over doctrine, encouraged his pilots to experiment with tactics that exploited the Thunderbolt's strengths. His pilots discovered that the P-47 excelled in high-speed slashing attacks from altitude. The tactic, simple in concept but demanding in execution, involved patrolling above bomber formations at 30,000 feet or higher, waiting for German interceptors to commit to attack runs, then diving at maximum speed to engage the enemy fighters before they could damage the bombers. This vertical tactics approach contradicted traditional fighter doctrine that emphasized sustained turning combat. Luftwaffe pilots, trained in energy management and angular maneuvering, initially found themselves baffled by American fighters that refused to dogfight. When German fighters turned to engage Thunderbolts, the American pilots would simply dive away, using their superior dive speed to escape. Then, energy preserved and altitude regained, the Thunderbolts would attack again from above. This pattern, repeated throughout combat, with frustrated German pilots unable to force decisive engagement while steadily losing altitude and energy. Eventually, the Luftwaffe fighters would exhaust their fuel and ammunition, forced to disengage and return to base, leaving bombers unmolested. The psychological frustration of being unable to force combat despite numerical equality or even superiority demoralized German pilots more than outright defeats might have done. The 56th Fighter Group's success with these tactics produced results that validated Zemke's approach. By December 1943, the unit had destroyed over 100 German aircraft while losing fewer than 30 Thunderbolts in combat. This exchange ratio, exceptional by any standard, demonstrated how proper tactics could multiply the Thunderbolt's inherent advantages. Other fighter groups studied the 56th's methods and adapted them to their operations. The 4th Fighter Group, initially equipped with British Spitfires and skeptical of the Thunderbolt, converted to P-47s and achieved similar results using vertical tactics. The 56th, the 4th, and the 58th Fighter Groups, all flying Thunderbolts, became the 3 highest-scoring fighter units in the 8th Air Force during the critical period from summer 1943 through spring 1944. German intelligence officers, studying American fighter tactics, recognized the threat but struggled to develop effective countermeasures. Traditional Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized aggressive pursuit and sustained combat. German pilots were taught to close with the enemy, maneuver for advantage, and press attacks until achieving decisive results. This doctrine, highly effective against Soviet and British fighters, proved counterproductive against Thunderbolts that refused to engage on German terms. Luftwaffe tacticians recommended new approaches, emphasizing patient stalking and coordinated attacks that would force Thunderbolts to commit to defensive combat. These recommendations, while theoretically sound, proved difficult to implement in practice. German formations had been degraded by losses to the point where coordinated attacks became impossible. Pilots lacked the training and experience needed to execute complex maneuvers under combat stress. Most critically, the psychological impact of repeatedly failing to engage an opponent who simply dove away whenever threatened eroded the confidence needed to attempt sophisticated tactics. The impact of Thunderbolt operations extended beyond direct combat to strategic effects that shaped the entire air war. Every mission that protected bombers from interceptors allowed those bombers to strike their targets effectively. The cumulative damage to German industry from sustained precision bombing, made possible by Thunderbolt escorts, far exceeded the direct impact of fighter combat. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, aircraft plants at Regensburg and Wiener Neustadt, synthetic oil refineries across the Ruhr Valley, all came under sustained attack, protected by fighters that German defences could not defeat. The industrial infrastructure that might have allowed Germany to match American production crumbled under bombardment that Thunderbolt escorts made sustainable. The attrition of experienced German pilots accelerated catastrophically during late 1943 and early 1944. Each mission saw veterans with hundreds of combat hours shot down and killed, often by American pilots with relatively limited experience flying aircraft that overcome the skill differential through performance advantages. Major Günther Röhl, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces, described in post-war interviews how the character of air combat changed fundamentally during this period. In 1941 and 42, we fought against opponents who were learning. Many Soviet and British pilots were inexperienced, and their aircraft, while capable, did not dominate ours. We could use our training and experience to achieve victories even when outnumbered. By 1944, we faced American pilots who, while perhaps not as individually skilled, flew aircraft that were simply better than ours. More critically, they were so numerous that we could not avoid combat when it was disadvantageous. We had to engage to protect our cities and factories, and engaging meant accepting losses we could not sustain. The mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against Germany. Each month, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 500 fighters and 400 pilots to all causes. American fighter production during the same period exceeded 1,500 aircraft monthly, with pilot training programs producing 800 new fighter pilots. The numerical balance shifted steadily in favor of the Allies, with each passing month seeing more American fighters and fewer German ones. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force alone could dispatch over 1,000 fighters on a single mission, a number that exceeded the entire operational strength of German fighter forces defending the western approaches to Germany. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became integrated into the daily experience of German military and civilian populations during 1944. Soldiers on the Western Front heard that distinctive rumble whenever Allied aircraft operated in their sector, which meant nearly constantly after D-Day. Civilians in German cities heard it as Thunderbolts escorted bombing raids or conducted low-level strafing attacks on transportation infrastructure. Luftwaffe pilots heard it during nearly every mission, a constant reminder that American air power was omnipresent and overwhelming. This acoustic saturation created psychological effects that transcended tactical considerations. The sound became associated with German powerlessness, a constant reminder that the nation faced enemies whose resources appeared infinite. The technical evolution of the Thunderbolt during its combat service demonstrated American capacity for rapid improvement and adaptation. Early P-47 models, designated B and C variants, had limited range and used the original Razorback canopy that restricted pilot visibility. By mid-1943, the D model introduced numerous improvements, including increased internal fuel capacity, provisions for external drop tanks, and refined engine controls that improved high-altitude performance. Late 1943 saw introduction of the bubble canopy that provided superior visibility. These improvements, implemented while maintaining high production rates, gave Thunderbolt pilots progressive advantages over German opponents flying aircraft that changed little from models introduced years earlier. The P-47D model, produced in greater numbers than any other Thunderbolt variant, incorporated lessons learned from combat operations. The universal wing, capable of carrying bombs and rockets, transformed the aircraft from pure fighter to multi-role fighter-bomber. The water methanol injection system, allowing temporary boost to 2,300 horsepower, provided emergency power that often meant the difference between survival and death in critical situations. The paddle blade propeller introduced on late production D models improved climb performance and high-altitude operation. Each modification reflected feedback from combat units, analyzed by engineers at Republic Aviation, and implemented through design changes that rippled through the production pipeline. This iterative improvement cycle, characteristic of American aircraft development during the war, ensured that Thunderbolts in combat always represented the latest thinking on how to maximize effectiveness. German attempts to counter Thunderbolt performance through aircraft development encountered repeated obstacles. The Focke-Wulf 190D model, featuring an inline engine intended to improve high-altitude performance, entered production too late and in too small numbers to affect the strategic balance. The Messerschmitt Bf 109K variant, incorporating various improvements to the venerable design, likewise appeared too late. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, potentially revolutionary, suffered from engine reliability problems and fuel shortages that limited operations. None of these developments, even if fully realized, would have overcome the numerical superiority the Allies had achieved by 1944. Germany needed not better fighters, but more fighters, produced in quantities that its bombed factories and resource-depleted economy could no longer sustain. The ground attack role that Thunderbolts increasingly assumed during 1944 showcased the aircraft's versatility and robust construction. While P-51 Mustangs took over long-range bomber escort duties due to their superior range, Thunderbolts transitioned to fighter-bomber operations supporting Allied ground forces. In this role, the P-47's ability to absorb ground fire proved invaluable. Anti-aircraft fire that would destroy lighter fighters merely damaged Thunderbolts that continued their attack runs and returned to base. The massive radial engine, positioned ahead of the pilot, served as an armor plate protecting against frontal fire. The redundant control systems meant that damage to one set of controls still left the aircraft flyable using backups. The robust landing gear, strengthened to support the aircraft's weight, could handle rough field operations that would destroy more delicate aircraft. The effectiveness of Thunderbolts in ground attack became legendary among Allied ground forces. When American or British soldiers called for air support, they hoped for Thunderbolts. The sight of P-47s orbiting overhead meant help was available. The sound of those engines, roaring as the aircraft dove to deliver rockets or bombs, meant enemy positions would soon be destroyed. The German experience of Thunderbolt ground attack represented the inverse of Allied confidence. Wehrmacht soldiers learned to dread clear weather that allowed Allied fighter bombers to operate. The appearance of Thunderbolts meant that movement in daylight became suicidal, that concentrations of vehicles or troops would be attacked within minutes, that even well-concealed positions might be discovered and destroyed. The acoustic signature of Thunderbolt engines became, for German ground forces, the sound of helplessness in the face of overwhelming air power. The scale of Thunderbolt ground attack operations during the Normandy campaign illustrates the impact of Allied air superiority. In the 2 months following D-Day, Thunderbolt units flew over 15,000 sorties against German ground forces. They destroyed approximately 3,000 vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, and uncounted smaller targets. They disrupted German supply lines to the point where armoured divisions sat immobilized for lack of fuel that could not be transported under Allied air attack. They forced German forces to move only at night, ceding initiative to Allied ground forces that could maneuver freely under friendly air cover. The cumulative effect exceeded the direct material damage. German formations, constantly harassed from the air and unable to concentrate forces without triggering devastating airstrikes, lost cohesion and offensive capability. The sound of Thunderbolt engines, omnipresent during daylight hours, served as constant reminder that German forces fought without air cover against an enemy who controlled the skies absolutely. The maintenance and logistical support for Thunderbolts demonstrated American organizational superiority. Each P-47 required extensive ground crew support. The complex turbocharger system needed regular inspection and adjustment. The 8 machine guns required cleaning, alignment, and ammunition loading. The radial engine needed frequent oil changes and cylinder inspections. Yet American maintenance organizations, staffed by trained mechanics using specialized tools and following detailed technical manuals, kept Thunderbolts operational at rates exceeding 80%. German fighter units, by comparison, struggled to maintain 50% operational rates due to parts shortages, undertrained mechanics, and inadequate maintenance facilities. The sound of Thunderbolt engines overhead thus represented not just individual aircraft, but an entire support infrastructure that kept those aircraft flying mission after mission. The impact of Thunderbolt superiority on German military operations extended far beyond air combat statistics. The Wehrmacht had pioneered combined arms warfare, using aircraft to provide reconnaissance, close air support, and interdiction that enabled ground forces to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. By mid-1943, Allied air superiority denied German forces these capabilities, while Allied aircraft attacked with impunity. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became synonymous with vulnerability for German soldiers who had once advanced confidently under Luftwaffe air cover. Now those same soldiers huddled in foxholes, watching helplessly as American fighters strafed supply columns, destroyed artillery positions, and cratered roads and rail lines. The psychological transformation from air superiority to air inferiority devastated German morale more than any single tactical defeat could have achieved. The strategic bombing campaign against German industry accelerated dramatically once Thunderbolts provided reliable escort. Prior to P-47 deployment in force, American daylight bombing missions over Germany suffered prohibitive losses. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers during a single mission to Schweinfurt, casualties that nearly forced suspension of daylight operations. With Thunderbolt escorts available in increasing numbers through late 1943 and into 1944, bomber losses decreased while mission effectiveness increased. German factories producing aircraft, engines, ball bearings, and synthetic fuel came under sustained attack. The industrial infrastructure that might have allowed Germany to match American production crumbled under precision bombardment protected by Thunderbolt fighters. German commanders attempting to devise countermeasures against Thunderbolts found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. Tactics that worked against other Allied fighters proved ineffective against P-47s. The Luftwaffe could not avoid combat, as bomber formations had to be engaged. They could not concentrate forces for overwhelming attacks, as Thunderbolt escorts appeared in such numbers that concentration merely presented target-rich environments for American pilots. They could not develop technical solutions, as German industry lacked the capacity to produce equivalent aircraft. They could not train replacements adequately, as fuel shortages prevented extensive flight training. Every potential solution required resources Germany no longer possessed or time Germany no longer had. The human cost of Thunderbolt superiority manifested in casualty statistics that revealed the catastrophic decline of the Luftwaffe. During 1943, Germany lost approximately 15,000 fighter pilots killed, missing, or permanently incapacitated. This represented nearly the entire pre-war Luftwaffe fighter force. Replacement pilots, hastily trained and thrust into combat against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, died at horrific rates. Some German fighter units reported pilot casualties exceeding 100% per month, meaning the entire unit roster turned over completely through losses. Veterans who survived multiple encounters with Thunderbolts described a pervasive sense of helplessness. They possessed skill and courage in abundance but flew aircraft that could not match their opponents and were outnumbered to the point where individual ability became irrelevant. The sound that haunted these men, the deep rumbling thunder of 18-cylinder radial engines amplified by turbochargers, became embedded in German military consciousness as the acoustic signature of defeat. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived the hell of Stalingrad and Kursk, reported that the sound of approaching Thunderbolts produced fear unlike anything they had experienced against Soviet forces. Soviet numerical superiority was expected and could be countered through tactical skill and determination. American material superiority, embodied in endless streams of thunderbolts that absorbed punishment and kept coming, represented something that courage alone could not overcome. When German soldiers heard that sound growing louder in the distance, they knew that survival depended not on fighting effectively but on finding adequate cover and hoping the Americans chose other targets. The post-war accounts of German military personnel provide the most compelling evidence of the Thunderbolt's psychological impact. Former Luftwaffe pilots, interviewed decades after the war, consistently cited the P-47 as the most difficult opponent they faced. These assessments came from men who had fought in every theatre, against every Allied fighter type, and who had no professional or political reason to exaggerate American capabilities. Their testimony reveals a professional respect tinged with bitter acknowledgement that they had faced an enemy whose industrial and technological superiority made German defeat inevitable, regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. The sound of Thunderbolt engines, they reported, announced the arrival of American power in a form that could not be denied, defeated, or endured. The broader strategic implications of Thunderbolt dominance extended to fundamental questions about industrial warfare. World War II represented the first conflict in which industrial capacity became the decisive factor in victory. Germany entered the war with superior tactical doctrine, better trained forces, and equipment that matched or exceeded Allied equivalents in most categories. Yet Germany's industrial base could not sustain total war against opponents whose combined production capacity exceeded German capabilities by orders of magnitude. The Thunderbolt exemplified this reality. It was not a miracle weapon or a revolutionary design. It was a competent fighter produced in such numbers that German forces were overwhelmed through sheer quantity backed by adequate quality. The production statistics tell this story starkly. Republic Aviation and its subcontractors manufactured over 15,000 Thunderbolts between 1941 and 1945. Peak production reached over 600 aircraft monthly. American factories operated 3 shifts daily, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and utilized mass production techniques that reduced manufacturing time and cost while maintaining quality. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 40,000 fighters of all types during the entire war. This included Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and various other designs. German production, while impressive given the constraints of strategic bombing and resource shortages, could not match American output. When German commanders heard Thunderbolt engines and realized that lost aircraft would be replaced faster than Germany could destroy them, they understood the war's outcome had been determined not on battlefields but in factories. The technological implications proved equally significant. The Thunderbolt's design incorporated systems that required advanced metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and quality control beyond German capabilities under wartime conditions. The turbocharger system alone demanded steel alloys capable of withstanding extreme thermal cycling, bearings manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, and control mechanisms that operated reliably in temperatures ranging from -40 to +400 degrees Fahrenheit. General Electric produced these systems in quantity while maintaining performance standards. German industry, lacking critical materials and increasingly subject to bombing disruption, could not replicate this achievement. The Thunderbolt thus represented not just numerical superiority but technological capabilities that revealed the depth of American industrial advantage. The training and logistics infrastructure supporting Thunderbolt operations provided another dimension of American superiority. Each P-47 required maintenance after every flight, major inspections every 50 hours, and engine overhauls every 200 hours. American maintenance organizations, staffed by mechanics who had completed months of specialized training and equipped with tools, parts, and technical documentation, performed these tasks efficiently. German maintenance capabilities, degraded by personnel shortages and parts scarcity, could not match American standards. The operational availability rates reflected this disparity. American fighter groups typically maintained 80 to 90% of assigned aircraft in mission-capable status. German fighter wings considered themselves fortunate to achieve 50% availability. When multiplied across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of missions, this differential became decisive. The ultimate measure of the Thunderbolts' impact emerged in post-war assessments conducted by military historians with access to complete records from all combatants. These studies consistently concluded that Allied air superiority was the decisive factor making German defeat inevitable after mid-1943. While multiple factors contributed to this superiority, including the P-51 Mustang's long-range escort capability and the development of radar-guided bombing systems, the Thunderbolts' role during the critical period from spring 1943 through summer 1944 proved essential. It provided the first reliable long-range escort, absorbed the Luftwaffe's best efforts to destroy bomber formations, and established Allied air dominance that would never be seriously challenged. The sound of its engines became the acoustic signature of Allied victory, because that sound announced the arrival of industrial power that Germany could not match, technological capability that Germany could not duplicate, and numerical superiority that Germany could not overcome. Former German military officers, who became military historians after the war, provided perhaps the most authoritative assessments. These men, freed from wartime propaganda constraints and motivated by desire to understand how Germany lost, analyzed the Thunderbolts' impact with professional detachment. Their consensus held that while the P-47 was not technically superior in all categories to the best German fighters, it combined good performance across all important parameters, with availability in numbers Germany could never match. More fundamentally, the Thunderbolt represented an American approach to warfare that emphasized reliable systems produced in quantity over perfect systems produced in limited numbers. This philosophy, alien to German military tradition that valued precision and technical excellence above all else, proved devastatingly effective in total war. The psychological dimension of facing Thunderbolts extended beyond tactical considerations to existential questions about Germany's ability to continue fighting. When Luftwaffe pilots heard those engines approaching and knew that no tactical brilliance would save them from overwhelming numbers of capable fighters, when Wehrmacht soldiers heard that sound and knew they would spend the next hours under attack without effective defense, when German civilians heard Thunderbolt engines over their cities and knew that bomber streams would follow protected by escorts they could not stop, the collective realization spread that Germany faced an enemy whose resources were infinite. This psychological defeat, perhaps more than any tactical reverse, determined the war's outcome. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became the sound of inevitable defeat because it announced that courage alone could not overcome industrial capacity, that tactical skill could not defeat strategic superiority, that Germany had entered a war against opponents whose combined power exceeded anything human valor could overcome. The legacy of the Thunderbolt's dominance extends beyond World War II to fundamental questions about modern warfare. The aircraft demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly organized and applied, could overcome tactical advantages enjoyed by technically proficient opponents. It showed that reliable systems produced in quantity often prove more valuable than perfect systems produced in limited numbers. It established that air superiority, once achieved, provides advantages across all dimensions of military operations. Most significantly, it revealed that total war between industrial powers is decided not by individual battles, but by nations' capacity to produce weapons and replace losses faster than enemies can inflict them. The sound of Thunderbolt engines, growing louder across Europe through 1943 and 44, announced these truths to German commanders who understood their implications but could do nothing to change them. The human stories behind these strategic realities provide the most compelling evidence of the Thunderbolt's impact. German pilots who survived the war often spoke of specific moments when they realized Germany could not win. For many, that moment came when they heard Thunderbolt engines for the first time and understood that America had deployed a fighter that combined capability with availability in numbers that made German resistance futile. These men described the growing sense of despair as each mission brought encounters with more Thunderbolts flown by increasingly skilled pilots. They recounted watching comrades, some with hundreds of victories, fall to American fighters whose pilots had months rather than years of experience, but flew aircraft that overcame the experience gap through sheer performance. They remembered the sound of those engines, distinctive and unmistakable, growing louder until it filled the sky, announcing that once again German forces would fight without hope of victory, trying only to survive another mission against impossible odds. The sound that German soldiers came to dread became, paradoxically, a source of pride for American personnel who built, maintained, and flew Thunderbolts. Factory workers at Republic aviation plants in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, took satisfaction in knowing their labor contributed directly to air superiority over Germany. Maintenance crews took pride in keeping their assigned aircraft operational mission after mission, understanding that reliability mattered as much as performance in determining combat effectiveness. Pilots developed deep affection for an aircraft that brought them home despite damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. The Thunderbolt's distinctive sound, result of its massive engine and turbocharger system, became a point of pride rather than concern. American airmen learned that when German pilots heard that sound approaching, fear rather than aggression resulted. The tables had turned completely from the early war years when Luftwaffe superiority was assumed. Now American pilots held every advantage and knew it. The technical excellence of the Thunderbolt's design became apparent only gradually as pilots explored its capabilities and engineers refined its systems. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born engineer who designed the P-47, created not a revolutionary aircraft but an extremely competent one that maximized the potential of available technology. The decision to use a massive radial engine, while initially controversial, proved inspired. The R-2800 Double Wasp was reliable, powerful, and tolerant of battle damage in ways that liquid-cooled engines could not match. The turbocharger system, complex and initially troublesome, provided altitude performance that made the Thunderbolt superior to all opponents above 25,000 feet. The sturdy airframe, overbuilt by some estimates, absorbed punishment that preserved pilots' lives and aircraft that could return to combat. Every design decision, while not individually revolutionary, combined to create an aircraft that excelled at its mission. The sound that resulted from this design, the deep-throated rumble of 18 cylinders firing in synchronized sequence, amplified by turbocharger, whine, and propeller noise, became as much a part of the Thunderbolt's effectiveness as its technical specifications. German forces learned to identify Thunderbolts by sound before visual contact became possible. That sound triggered reactions ranging from evasive action to simple resignation depending on circumstances. Fighter pilots hearing that sound while low on fuel or ammunition knew they faced potentially fatal encounters. Bomber crews hearing it while under attack knew salvation was near. Ground troops hearing it knew air support was arriving or that they should seek cover immediately. The acoustic signature of the Thunderbolt became tactically significant because it provided advance warning that shaped behavior before visual contact occurred. The mathematical inevitability of Germany's defeat became apparent to professional military analysts long before the war's end. Production figures, loss rates, and replacement capacities told a story that admitted no alternative interpretation. Germany produced approximately 40,000 fighters during the entire war. America produced over 100,000 military aircraft of all types between 1941 and 1945, including over 15,000 Thunderbolts alone. German pilot training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and the need to rush replacements to combat units, produced pilots with inadequate preparation. American training programs, blessed with abundant resources and time to prepare pilots thoroughly, produced aviators ready for combat's demands. German maintenance organizations struggled to keep half their fighters operational. American maintenance units routinely achieved 80% readiness rates. These numbers, analyzed dispassionately, revealed that Germany faced an opponent whose advantages in every category compounded to create insuperable superiority. When German commanders heard Thunderbolt engines and said, "It's over," they were acknowledging mathematical reality rather than expressing defeatist sentiment. They understood that their forces, however skilled and courageous, fought an opponent whose resources were effectively infinite. They recognized that every Thunderbolt destroyed would be replaced by 2 more, that every pilot shot down would be succeeded by 3 freshly trained replacements, that every damaged aircraft would be repaired or replaced within days. Most critically, they understood that Germany possessed no response to this material superiority. There was no secret weapon that would restore balance, no tactical innovation that would overcome numerical disadvantage, no strategic shift that would change the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity. The sound of Thunderbolt engines announced these truths with brutal clarity. It was the sound of American factories running 3 shifts daily. It was the sound of training programs producing pilots faster than Germany could kill them. It was the sound of logistics systems that maintained aircraft across thousands of miles of ocean. It was the sound of industrial warfare waged by a nation whose capacity exceeded anything Germany could match or counter. The Thunderbolt sound became so deeply associated with German defeat that it persisted in collective memory long after the war's end. Veterans on both sides, when describing their combat experiences, often mentioned that distinctive engine note. German veterans described it as the sound of approaching doom, an acoustic warning that preceded attacks they could rarely avoid or survive. American veterans described it as the sound of power and confidence, knowing their aircraft gave them every advantage over opponents. Historians analyzing the air war consistently identified the Thunderbolt as decisive in establishing Allied air superiority during the critical period when Germany might still have recovered from earlier setbacks. The aircraft's impact extended beyond tactical victories to strategic dominance that shaped the war's entire final phase. The story of how German commanders came to say "it's over" when hearing P-47 Thunderbolts is ultimately the story of industrial capacity determining modern warfare's outcome. The Thunderbolts succeeded not through revolutionary technology or perfect design, but through the combination of good performance, robust construction, and availability in numbers that overwhelmed opponents. It represented American advantages in resources, industrial capacity, and organizational efficiency translated into an aircraft that could be produced in quantity while maintaining quality sufficient to defeat the best German fighters. When German soldiers and pilots heard that distinctive sound, they heard the voice of American industry announcing that Germany faced an enemy whose power was effectively unlimited. That sound meant skilled pilots flying capable aircraft supported by infinite logistics would continue attacking until Germany's capacity to resist collapsed completely. The sound meant courage and skill, while admirable, could not overcome material superiority. The sound meant the war was over, even though the fighting continued, because mathematics had rendered Germany's strategic situation hopeless. The thunder of Thunderbolt engines thus became more than just aircraft noise. It became the acoustic signature of Allied victory, the sound of factories in Detroit and New York and California working around the clock to produce weapons Germany could not match. It became the sound of American industrial might projected across the Atlantic in a form that could not be ignored or denied. The specific combat incidents that illustrated Thunderbolt dominance became legendary among both American and German pilots, passed down through oral tradition and eventually documented in unit histories and personal memoirs. On March 8, 1944, the 56th Fighter Group encountered a formation of approximately 40 Messerschmitt 109s and Fokker-Wulf 190s attacking bombers near Berlin. The Thunderbolt pilots, led by Major David Schilling, dove from altitude and engaged the German fighters. In the resulting combat, which lasted approximately 15 minutes, the 56th claimed 18 German aircraft destroyed without losing a single Thunderbolt. German records confirmed loss of 16 fighters in this engagement, with 4 pilots killed and 12 wounded or missing. This exchange ratio, exceptional even by American standards, demonstrated how training, tactics, and aircraft performance combined to create overwhelming superiority. The German pilots who survived this encounter described an experience that defied their training and expectations. They had approached the bomber formation confident that numbers and tactical position favored them. They had seen the Thunderbolt escorts but assumed, based on previous experience, that aggressive attack would force the Americans to defend bombers rather than seeking combat. Instead, The Thunderbolts dove into the German formation with such speed and aggression that the carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos within seconds. German fighters scattered, trying to evade while simultaneously attempting to maintain formation integrity. The Thunderbolts pursued relentlessly, their superior dive speed allowing them to close on any German fighter that attempted to disengage. The sound of their engines, growing louder as they closed for attack, became associated in survivors' minds with helplessness and terror. One German pilot, interrogated after being shot down, stated that the sound of Thunderbolts diving is the last thing many of my friends heard. When you hear that sound getting louder, you know you have seconds to live, unless you can somehow evade. But evading is nearly impossible because they are faster, better armed, and there are always more of them than you. The scale of Thunderbolt operations during the climactic battles of spring and summer 1944 illustrated how American industrial capacity transformed air combat from a clash between individual warriors into an industrial process. During Big Week in February 1944, Thunderbolt units flew over 3,000 sorties in 6 days. During the April raids on Berlin, they flew over 5,000 sorties in a single month. During the Normandy campaign supporting the invasion, P-47 units flew over 20,000 sorties between June and August. These sortie rates, sustained month after month, represented operational tempos that Germany could never match. The Luftwaffe, struggling with fuel shortages and pilot exhaustion, achieved roughly half the sortie rate despite defending their homeland against invasion. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became omnipresent across Western Europe because there were thousands of sorties being flown continuously, creating a sound environment where German forces existed under constant aerial threat. The maintenance achievements that kept Thunderbolts operational deserve recognition equal to the pilots' combat achievements. Ground crews worked around the clock to repair battle damage, perform scheduled maintenance, and prepare aircraft for next day's missions. Technical sergeants diagnosed complex turbocharger problems using limited diagnostic equipment and their own accumulated expertise. Armament specialists loaded ammunition, aligned guns, and repaired battle-damaged weapons systems. Engine mechanics changed spark plugs, adjusted timing, and performed cylinder replacements that kept radial engines running reliably mission after mission. These ground crews, often overlooked in combat histories, made possible the sortie rates that overwhelmed German defences. Without their skill and dedication, the Thunderbolt would have been merely another capable fighter rather than the decisive weapon it became. The logistics miracle that supported Thunderbolt operations involved moving millions of tons of supplies across submarine-infested Atlantic waters to bases in England. Every mission required fuel, oil, ammunition, spare parts, and countless other consumables. A single Thunderbolt sortie consumed approximately 200 gallons of fuel, 80 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per gun, and generated wear on components that required eventual replacement. Multiply this by thousands of sorties monthly, and the logistics requirements become staggering. American logistics organizations met these requirements through systematic planning, efficient transportation, and robust supply chains that ensured critical items reached units when needed. German logistics, by comparison, crumbled under the combined pressure of Allied bombing and resource exhaustion. Luftwaffe units often possessed aircraft that could not fly due to lack of fuel, guns that could not fire due to lack of ammunition, or engines that could not run due to lack of spare parts. The sound of Thunderbolt engines represented not just superior aircraft but superior logistics that kept those aircraft flying. The psychological warfare dimension of Thunderbolt operations manifested in ways that transcended tactical effectiveness. The German civilian population, listening to Allied radio broadcasts and reading sanitized reports in German newspapers, gradually understood that the Luftwaffe could no longer protect them from Allied air power. When Thunderbolts escorted bombers over German cities in broad daylight, flying unpursued while anti-aircraft fire proved ineffective, the visual evidence of air superiority became undeniable. When German fighters attempted interception and were shot down in sight of civilians watching from below, the reality of German defeat became inescapable. The sound of Thunderbolt engines, growing louder month by month as Allied air operations intensified, served as acoustic reminder that Germany faced an enemy whose power was irresistible. The impact on German industrial morale compounded strategic effects of bombing. Factory workers, enduring repeated air raids while knowing that Luftwaffe fighters could not protect them, became demoralized and less productive. Absenteeism increased as workers sought safety in countryside rather than reporting to factories that were certain to be targeted. The quality of German manufactured goods declined as skilled workers were conscripted for military service and replaced by forced laborers who lacked training and motivation. The sound of American aircraft, particularly the distinctive rumble of Thunderbolt engines, became associated with death, destruction, and the futility of continued resistance. This psychological impact, while difficult to quantify, contributed significantly to the collapse of German war production during 1944 and 45. The specific technical innovations that improved Thunderbolt performance throughout its service life demonstrated American engineering sophistication and organizational capacity for rapid improvement. The bubble canopy, introduced in mid-1943, provided visibility that allowed pilots to detect threats earlier and maintain formation integrity more easily. The paddle blade propeller, incorporating wider blade tips, improved climb performance and high-altitude operation. The universal wing hardpoints allowed rapid reconfiguration from pure fighter to fighter bomber to reconnaissance platform. Water methanol injection provided emergency power that proved decisive in critical combat situations. These improvements, each relatively minor individually, combined to maintain the Thunderbolt's competitive advantage even as German aircraft evolved. The sound of Thunderbolt engines represented not static technology but continuous improvement that kept American fighters ahead of German developments. The training programs that prepared Thunderbolt pilots evolved continuously based on combat experience. Early training emphasized basic flight skills and simple tactics. By mid-1944, training incorporated sophisticated formation tactics, advanced gunnery techniques, and survival skills drawn from combat veterans' experiences. Replacement pilots arriving at combat units in late 1944 possessed preparation superior to the veterans they were joining, having benefited from lessons learned at the cost of earlier casualties. This continuous improvement cycle, characteristic of American military organization, ensured that pilot quality improved even as combat intensity increased. German pilot training, by contrast, declined throughout the war due to fuel shortages and accelerated timelines. The gulf between American and German pilot preparation widened continuously, compounding the aircraft performance advantage Americans already enjoyed. The post-war assessments of Thunderbolt effectiveness, conducted by military historians with access to records from all participants, confirmed what German commanders had realized during the war. The P-47 was the decisive factor in achieving Allied air superiority during the critical period from spring 1943 through summer 1944. While other factors contributed, including the P-51 Mustang's longer range and the sheer number of Allied aircraft, the Thunderbolt's combination of capability and availability made it irreplaceable. Its robust construction allowed operations in conditions that would ground more delicate fighters. Its powerful armament made it effective against fighters and bombers alike. Its altitude performance dominated the airspace where strategic bombing occurred. Most critically, it was produced in numbers that overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became the sound of Allied victory, because that sound announced the arrival of a weapon system that embodied every American advantage in a single package. The legacy of Thunderbolt operations extended beyond World War II to shape post-war understanding of air power and industrial warfare. The aircraft demonstrated that sustained air superiority could be achieved and maintained through proper combination of technology, training, logistics, and industrial production. It showed that fighter aircraft need not be perfect in every category to be effective, requiring only sufficient capability across important parameters combined with availability in decisive numbers. It established that modern warfare between industrial powers would be decided not by individual heroism, but by nations' capacity to produce and sustain military forces over extended periods. The distinctive rumble of Thunderbolt engines, which had terrorized German forces during the war, became in peacetime a reminder of these lessons. The sound represented not just an aircraft, but an entire approach to warfare that emphasized systematic preparation, robust engineering, and overwhelming material advantage over tactical brilliance and individual courage. The human dimension of the Thunderbolt story, often overlooked in technical histories, provides the most compelling evidence of the aircraft's impact. The American pilots who flew P-47s developed deep affection for an aircraft that brought them home despite damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. The ground crews who maintained Thunderbolts took pride in keeping their assigned aircraft operational through countless missions. The factory workers who built them understood that their labor contributed directly to victory. These personal connections between people and machine transformed the Thunderbolt from mere equipment into a symbol of American power and technological prowess. When veterans heard that distinctive engine sound decades after the war, at air shows or in historical documentaries, they experienced emotions ranging from pride to nostalgia to profound sadness for friends who never returned. The sound carried meaning that transcended its physical characteristics, embodying memories of youth, war, courage, loss, and eventual victory. The German experience of that same sound carried opposite emotions. Veterans who had endured Thunderbolt attacks described hearing restored P-47s at post-war air shows as emotionally complex experiences. The sound triggered memories of fear, helplessness, and grief for lost comrades. Yet time and distance from war's immediacy also allowed grudging respect for an aircraft that had beaten them fairly through superior performance and greater numbers. Former Luftwaffe pilot Günther Röhrl, attending an air show in 1992, provided commentary as a restored Thunderbolt performed demonstration flights. As the aircraft dove past the crowd, engine roaring and turbocharger whistling, Röhrl stated, "There is the sound. After almost 50 years, it still makes my heart race. Not from fear anymore, but from memory. That sound reminds me of friends lost, battles fought, and a war we could not win. It reminds me that wars are decided not by courage alone, but by nations' capacity to produce weapons their enemies cannot match." When we heard that sound in 1944, we knew we faced an enemy whose industrial power was limitless. Today I can admire the engineering and respect the men who flew and built these aircraft. But I will never forget what that sound meant during the war. It meant the end was coming and we could not stop it. The tactical evolution of Thunderbolt employment throughout the war demonstrated how American forces learned and adapted continuously. Early missions in spring 1943 saw P-47s employed in rigid formations that limited their effectiveness. Pilots flew prescribed patterns that German interceptors learned to exploit. By summer 1943, fighter group commanders were experimenting with more flexible tactics that allowed pilots to react dynamically to threats. The Finger 4 formation, adopted from Luftwaffe practice, replaced the three-ship Vic that had proven vulnerable. Freelance sections roamed ahead of bomber streams, seeking German fighters before they could organize attacks. These tactical innovations, combined with improving pilot skills and aircraft performance enhancements, transformed Thunderbolt effectiveness from adequate to overwhelming. The specific engagement profiles that Thunderbolt pilots developed exploited the aircraft's strengths while minimizing weaknesses. The ideal attack involved identifying German fighters from altitude, positioning upward of the enemy formation, then diving at maximum speed to deliver a high-speed firing pass. The Thunderbolt's superior dive speed ensured closure on any target. The 8 machine guns provided firepower density that made brief firing opportunities lethal. After the first pass, if the target survived, the Thunderbolt pilot would zoom back to altitude using energy preserved during the dive, reposition, and attack again. This boom and zoom tactic, simple in concept but demanding in execution, proved devastatingly effective against German fighters optimized for sustained turning combat. German pilots attempted to develop counter-tactics that would negate Thunderbolt advantages. They tried splitting their formations to force American fighters to commit to attacking one element while the other escaped. They attempted to lure Thunderbolts into protracted combats that would exhaust American ammunition and fuel. They experimented with attacking from above, seeking to negate the altitude advantage Americans typically enjoyed. None of these tactics proved consistently effective. The fundamental problem was that Thunderbolts appeared in such numbers that any tactic that worked against a small formation proved useless when 30 or 40 P-47s participated in the engagement. German pilots might successfully evade 2 or 3 Thunderbolts only to encounter 6 more arriving from a different direction. The sound of engines seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, creating acoustic confusion that compounded visual disorientation caused by dozens of aircraft maneuvering in close proximity. The ground attack missions that Thunderbolts increasingly undertook during 1944 expanded the aircraft's impact beyond air superiority to direct support of ground operations. The transition from pure fighter to multi-role fighter-bomber occurred gradually as commanders recognized that the P-47's robust construction made it ideal for attacking targets defended by anti-aircraft fire. The first experiments with bomb carrying occurred in late 1943, with pilots improvising mounting systems for 500-pound bombs under their fuselages. By mid-1944, P-47s routinely carried 1,000 pounds of bombs plus rockets, transforming them into devastating ground attack platforms. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became familiar to German ground forces as the prelude to attacks that destroyed vehicles, artillery, supply dumps, and troop concentrations with precision that strategic bombers could not match. The specific capabilities that made Thunderbolts effective in ground attack reflected careful engineering that emphasized survivability and firepower. The radial engine, positioned ahead of the cockpit, served as armor protecting the pilot from frontal fire. The sturdy landing gear allowed operations from rough forward airfields that would damage fighters with more delicate undercarriages. The 8 machine guns could strafe targets continuously for 15 to 20 seconds, long enough to destroy multiple vehicles in a single pass. The bomb load, while modest compared to dedicated attack aircraft, provided precision strike capability against point targets. Most critically, the Thunderbolt's ability to absorb battle damage meant that pilots could press attacks through defensive fire that would force other aircraft to break off. The sound of Thunderbolts making repeated attack runs, each pass accompanied by the roar of diving engines and the thunder of guns firing, became the soundtrack of German defeat in France during summer 1944. The Normandy campaign provided the ultimate test of Thunderbolt effectiveness in combined arms operations. 9th Air Force P-47 groups, operating from forward airfields in France, flew close air support missions coordinated with ground forces advancing against German defensive positions. Fighter controllers, embedded with ground units and equipped with radios, directed Thunderbolt strikes against targets identified in real time. This integration of air and ground power, unprecedented in scale and sophistication, allowed Allied forces to call in precision airstrikes within minutes of identifying enemy positions. German forces, accustomed to fighting under air cover that protected them from aerial attack, found themselves completely exposed to strikes they could neither evade nor effectively counter. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became synonymous with American offensive power, announcing that every German position, no matter how well fortified, could be destroyed by aircraft that appeared within minutes of being requested. The statistics from the Normandy campaign reveal the scale of Thunderbolt operations. Between June 6 and August 31, 1944, 9th Air Force P-47 units flew approximately 22,000 sorties. They destroyed over 4,000 vehicles, 800 artillery pieces, and uncounted smaller targets. They claimed approximately 600 German aircraft destroyed, though actual losses were likely lower due to overclaiming inevitable in air combat's confusion. More significantly, they created an operational environment where German forces could not concentrate for counterattacks, could not move supplies during daylight, and could not maneuver without risking immediate air attack. This indirect effect, achieved through the sustained presence of Thunderbolts that German forces knew they could not challenge, exceeded the direct material damage. The sound of Thunderbolt engines, audible almost continuously during daylight hours across the Normandy battlefield, reminded German soldiers that they fought without air cover against an enemy who controlled the skies absolutely. The technical challenges of maintaining Thunderbolts in forward operating conditions demonstrated American logistical sophistication. Aircraft operating from rough airfields in France experienced accelerated wear on landing gear, propellers, and engines from ingesting dust and debris. Battle damage from ground fire required immediate repair to maintain operational strength. The complex turbocharger system needed careful maintenance to prevent failures that would leave aircraft unable to reach combat altitude. American maintenance organizations met these challenges through careful planning, adequate spare parts inventory, and skilled mechanics capable of improvising solutions when standard procedures proved inadequate. Mobile repair units, equipped with machine shops and specialized tools, performed major repairs that would normally require factory facilities. This maintenance capability kept Thunderbolt availability rates above 80%, even when operating from primitive forward bases under combat conditions. The broader strategic impact of Thunderbolt operations extended to shaping the entire character of warfare in Western Europe after D-Day. German forces that had pioneered mobile warfare through combined arms operations featuring close coordination between ground forces and air power now found themselves fighting without effective air cover. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine assumed friendly air superiority, or at minimum air parity, allowing ground forces to maneuver, concentrate, and execute coordinated attacks. Allied air superiority, achieved and maintained primarily through Thunderbolt operations, rendered German doctrine obsolete. German armored formations that attempted to maneuver during daylight were destroyed by fighter-bomber attacks before they could engage Allied ground forces. German infantry that attempted to move between positions were strafed into immobility. German supply columns that attempted to transport ammunition and fuel forward were obliterated within sight of the units they were intended to support. The sound of Thunderbolt engines became the sound of German tactical helplessness, a constant reminder that the Wehrmacht's vaunted tactical excellence meant nothing when operating without air cover against an enemy who controlled the skies. The morale impact on German forces cannot be quantified but was nonetheless decisive. Soldiers interviewed after capture consistently identified Allied air power as the factor most destructive to their fighting effectiveness and will to continue resisting. They described feeling helpless under constant aerial threat, endangered during every daylight movement, skeptical about their leaders' promises of eventual victory. The sound of Thunderbolt engines triggered responses ranging from immediate seeking of cover to simple resignation that death was imminent and unavoidable. Some German units experienced breakdowns in discipline as soldiers refused to obey orders, requiring movement during daylight when air attack was certain. Others saw dramatic increases in desertion rates as men decided that survival through surrender was preferable to continued fighting under impossible conditions. The psychological defeat of the Wehrmacht, achieved in part through the sustained presence of Thunderbolts that German forces could neither avoid nor effectively engage, contributed as much to Allied victory as the physical destruction those aircraft inflicted. The evolution of American fighter pilot culture during the war reflected the Thunderbolts' influence on how airmen understood their mission and capabilities. Early American fighter pilots, influenced by romantic notions of aerial combat as individual contests between knights of the air, emphasized personal victory tallies and sought dogfights that would allow them to demonstrate superior skill. By mid-1944, American fighter pilots understood their mission differently. Victory meant protecting bombers, destroying German aircraft before they could damage the bombers, and returning safely to fly again the next day. The Thunderbolt's characteristics encouraged this more pragmatic approach. Its performance allowed pilots to engage or disengage at will, choosing combat when conditions favored them and avoiding it when circumstances were unfavorable. Its robust construction meant that pressing an attack to ensure target destruction was survivable even when the target returned fire. Its heavy armament meant that brief firing opportunities, carefully executed, produced decisive results without requiring extended combat. The sound of Thunderbolt engines came to represent this professional approach to air combat, a sound that announced not individual glory seekers, but skilled professionals executing their mission with maximum effectiveness and minimum risk. The post-war careers of Thunderbolt pilots provided evidence of how their wartime experiences shaped American military aviation. Many became test pilots, using skills developed in combat to evaluate next-generation fighters. Others joined commercial aviation, bringing combat-learned discipline and decision-making to civilian flying. Some remained in military service, rising to senior positions where they influenced doctrine, aircraft development, and training programs. Francis Gabreski, who scored 28 victories in Thunderbolts, continued his career through the Korean War, where he added 6.5 more victories flying F-86 Sabres, retiring as a colonel. Robert Johnson, after scoring 27 victories, left active service to work for Republic Aviation, helping design and promote the successor aircraft to the Thunderbolt. Hub Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group to become the highest-scoring P-47 unit, became a senior Air Force officer whose influence on tactical fighter doctrine lasted decades. These men carried with them lessons learned while flying Thunderbolts, lessons about the importance of aircraft performance, the value of robust engineering, and the necessity of supporting pilots with adequate training and logistics. The Thunderbolt's sound became so deeply embedded in cultural memory that it appeared in countless post-war books, films, and television programs depicting World War II air combat. Audio recordings of P-47 engines became standard sound effects used whenever producers needed to represent American fighter aircraft. Veterans listening to these recordings reported immediate emotional responses, the sound triggering memories that decades had not dimmed. The distinctive note, produced by 18 cylinders firing in precisely timed sequence with turbocharger providing background whistle, remained immediately recognizable to anyone who had heard it during the war. Modern air shows featuring restored Thunderbolts consistently draw crowds, including veterans from both sides who come specifically to hear that sound again, this time in peacetime context, where it can be appreciated for its engineering achievement rather than feared for what it represented during combat. The technical legacy of the Thunderbolt influenced post-war American fighter design in ways both obvious and subtle. The emphasis on robust construction became standard practice, with later fighters built to survive battle damage and rough handling. The understanding that altitude performance required sophisticated supercharging systems influenced jet engine development. The recognition that heavy armament increased combat effectiveness led to fighters armed with cannons rather than machine guns. Perhaps most significantly, the Thunderbolt demonstrated that large, heavy fighters could be effective when their performance characteristics matched mission requirements. This lesson influenced designs ranging from the F-84 Thunderjet, spiritual successor to the Thunderbolt, through the F-15 Eagle, which embodied similar philosophy of achieving superiority through robust engineering and superior performance rather than minimum weight and maximum agility. It became the sound of modern warfare where victory goes not to the bravest soldiers but to nations whose economies can sustain total war. When German commanders heard those engines and acknowledged the war was lost, they were recognizing a fundamental truth about 20th century conflict. Industrial capacity, properly mobilized and applied, creates military advantages that courage alone cannot overcome. The distinctive rumble of 2,000 horsepower radial engines, multiplied by 15,000 aircraft, delivered that lesson with brutal clarity to an enemy who could only listen as the sound grew louder and closer, announcing defeat that was inevitable, unstoppable, and irreversible.